cooked for the entire school. They accused her of putting goat dung in the pudding because it tasted so dreadful, and she certainly wasn't serving enough beer. And eventually there were so many protests that Harvard shut down for a year while they tried to recover from the Eatons and replace them. So food has some unexpected effects here. Okay, one of the first things I came up against in writing this book was what's a vegetable, which is actually a lot more complicated than you might think. Botanically, all these things up on the screen are not vegetables, they are fruits. So tomatoes, peppers, eggplants, cucumbers, squash, pumpkins, basically anything that's got seeds in it is a fruit. It develops from the fertilized ovary of a flower, and it's not a vegetable, even though we think it is. Botanically, anything that is a part of a plant that we eat that's not a fruit is a vegetable. So spinach and lettuce, which are leaves, carrots and beets, which are roots, broccoli, which is a flower, potato, which is a tuber, all of these are genuine vegetables. Okay, that's a botanist's view, but this gets miserable fast. So back in the 1880s, a guy named John Nix imported from the West Indies into the port of New York a batch of tomatoes. And at the time, there was a tariff against the importation of foreign vegetables. So in theory, Nix was going to have to pay a 10% fee on his batch of tomatoes. But Nix knew his botany and said, forget it, I'm not paying this, tomatoes are a fruit. This thing went all the way to the Supreme Court, where a justice named Gray ruled that the tomato, politically, economically, was a vegetable, on the grounds that you eat tomatoes along with the main course. You know, you eat it along with the meat and potatoes, not as dessert along with the ice cream and cake. So, tomatoes are now a vegetable. Well, this was quickly followed up by truffles, onions, water chestnuts, all of which, by Supreme Court decree, became vegetables, except rhubarb. Rhubarb's kind of interesting. Rhubarb is like celery. Both of these are enlarged leaf petioles, you know, that skinny little stem that connects a leaf to a branch. Well, in celery and rhubarb, these are big and crunchy. I don't know where the rhubarb ruling came from, but I think the best guess is they're probably referring to strawberry rhubarb pie. So, you know, maybe this is what makes rhubarb a fruit rather than a veggie. Where things got even more complicated was with this. This is what was called the Chicago World's Fair, the world's Colombian Exposition of 1893, which at the time was like the Disney World of its time. It had 27 million visitors, 65,000 exhibits from all over the world. It had a Venus de Milo in chocolate. It had a map of the US in pickles. It had a herd of ostriches. Had the world's first Ferris wheel, which was gigantic. It could carry 2,000 people at a time. It had a cheese disaster. Canada, by railway, shipped down an immense multi-ton wheel of cheese, which promptly crashed through the floor of the Canadian building and had to be carted over to the agricultural building and put on a concrete slab. But this is where we really run into the vegetable problem. A women's gardening club decided it would be really nice at the Chicago World's Fair to have a garland of flowers, one chosen by each state. And you would think this was easy, but it was not. Minnesota just came roaring right out and picked the lady slipper for theirs, but everybody else had huge problems. There were debates before state legislatures over, which flower is best for us. New Hampshire actually had quite an argument in their state Congress over lilac versus apple blossom. So the National Garden of Flowers took a long time to put together. Once it was put together, however, the states just jumped on this. They thought this was wonderful. So then this was followed up by state birds, state trees, state rocks, state everything else you can think of. Vermont's got a huge long list. We've got a state warm water fish and a state cold water fish. We have a state beverage, which is milk. But in terms of state fruits and vegetables, this was a can of worms. Tennessee and Ohio, both good botanists, declared the tomato their state fruit. Alabama, which was sitting on the fence, declared the tomato both their state fruit and their state vegetable, just to make sure everybody got it. Louisiana, which already had a state vegetable, which was the sweet potato, which is a vegetable, declared the tomato their state vegetable plant. And I quote, "The best one, the absolute best, is Oklahoma. Oklahoma's state fruit is the strawberry, and its state vegetable is the watermelon. And the reason it's the watermelon is this was promoted by a representative from a watermelon growing district who in his youth had won a watermelon seed spitting contest and promoted the watermelon as a vegetable on the grounds that it was related to the gourd, which was sort of vegetable-like. So anyway, Oklahoma, watermelon's a veggie. Now in Vermont, our state vegetable is the Gilfeather turnip. And this is John Gilfeather of turnip fame. It's not exactly thanks to him that we've got the Gilfeather turnip. Apparently, he was very protective of his turnip and would chop off the tops and the roots before he brought any of the turnips to market. At some point, clearly he slipped up because we've still got the turnip. But now, has anybody been to the Wardsboro Turnip Festival? Okay, this is a treat you all have in store. This is advertised as America's best turnip culinary event, which I'm sure it is. There's not much competition. There's turnip contests for, most beautiful turnip, ugliest turnip, largest turnip, best turnip dish. There's even a commemorative turnip song, the refrain to which is, you can eat them boiled, you can eat them mashed, you can even eat them in your hash. So it's a thing to think about for the future. The origin of turnips is a bit of a mystery. It was already an important agricultural crop in the days of the Romans. But we know that it was grown and eaten much earlier than that. It's likely came from a wild ancestor somewhere between Europe and Asia. And at first it was grown for its leaves, its spicy leaves, and particularly for its seeds, which could be crushed for oil. This form of turnip is generally known as Asian rape. So it was called rapeseed oil, which nobody really appreciated much. That's kind of a touchy name. So later there was some biochemistry that was done in creating a better oil, which they called canola oil, which is what's generally sold now in supermarkets. Rape oil, just no. Turnips, by and large, aren't high on anybody's gardening list. Usually turnips are popular in times of war, in times of famine, when you couldn't grow anything else but turnips. they're a pretty good solid crop for times of trouble. And everybody was fairly eager to pawn the turnips off on the orphanages and the poor. They were great peasant food. Throughout the Middle Ages, anything that was essentially worthless was said to be not worth a turnip. If you were a turnip eater, you were a country bumpkin. Turnips just didn't have great press. One place where turnips really shine, though, is in fairy tales. There are a number of folk and fairy tales for kids about humongous turnips. Stories about turnips so big that a cow could eat its way through it and all you would see was the tip of its tail. There's a Grimm Brothers fairy tale titled The Turnip, in which a poor farmer grows a particularly wonderful turnip and brings it as a gift to the king and is rewarded with a bag of gold. So he trots home with his bag of gold, and he's got, depending on the version of the story, either a nasty neighbor, brother-in-law, or stepbrother, who then decides to give a horse to the king, thinking, huge sack of gold. Instead, he gets the turnip. Yes, comeuppance. World wars always had turnip winters when people were eating basically nothing but turnip. During World War II, there was a recipe that was handed down from the Ministry of Food for a dish called Woolsen Pie. And we've got a diary quote from a woman who recorded all her experiences on the home front in Britain during World War II, who wrote that her 6-year-old son would burst into tears when he heard the term Woolsen Pie, which contained a lot of turnip. Actually, this recipe doesn't look all that bad. But apparently, if it's pretty much turnip, and nothing but turnip, it's a lot less exciting. Our turnip, the Gilfeather turnip, incidentally, might just possibly be a rutabaga instead of a turnip. There's some genetic analysis that shows that cabbage has 18 chromosomes, turnips have 20 chromosomes, rutabagas have 38 chromosomes. The rutabaga is a cross between a cabbage and a turnip. Well, there's some research that indicates that our Gilfeather turnip has 38 chromosomes, so it might be the Gilfeather rutabaga. I don't think the research is all in yet. Okay, turnip isn't a top-of-the-line favored vegetable. Often seed catalogs just skip turnip and go directly from tomato to watermelon without even pausing at turnip. But even worse in terms of least favored vegetables are beets. Lots of people do not like beets. In fact, in this country, we plant more land in turnips than we do in beets, which goes to show something. Anybody here hate beets? Any beet haters? Yes. I'm fine with beets. I don't like lima beans. We'll get to lima beans. But this molecule is the reason that we don't like beets. This is geosmin. It's an organic compound that's made by soil bacteria. And we're very, very sensitive to this stuff. We can detect it in nanogram quantities, like 10 parts per trillion. And it tastes like dirt. It gives that kind of little earthy tang to beets. And I think it's good in beets. Apparently, it's dreadful in catfish. And you don't want this in your wine. Wine with a touch of dirt doesn't do anything for wine. Some research shows that our sensitivity to this thing is something that we share with camels. Camels can detect the smell of geosmin from miles away. And it's an advantage to camels because it shows them where an oasis is. These bacteria thrive in wet ground in the middle of the desert, And, if you can detect geosmin, you can find a watering hole. It's also the stuff that, that really nice smell that you get after a rain in the garden. That's geosmin. It's also sometimes called petrichor. Internationally, there are polls all over the place about most hated vegetables. Internationally, most hated seems to be the Brussels sprout. Nobody. I know, and they're so cute, those tiny little cabbages. But it varies a bit from country to country. Apparently, the British don't like celery. The Japanese don't like bell peppers. George W. Bush loathed broccoli. And nobody's really certain exactly why we hate the things that we hate. The best guess seems to be unfamiliarity. And there have been a number of studies shown that if you've got something you absolutely loathe, I know you're all thinking of it, chicken livers, tripe, pea soup. If you try it 9 times, they call this the 9 times rule. So choke it down 9 times, and you'll find that you've accustomed yourself to it, and you're starting to actually like it. I have not tried this with lima beans, and I don't intend to. But part of the reason we don't like things might also be genetic. There are a lot of people who really do not like the taste of cilantro. They compare it to soap and to crushed bugs. And one of these persons was Julia Child, who said that the only reasonable thing to do with cilantro was to throw it on the floor and stamp upon it. And it looks like the problem with cilantro is actually genetic. There's a specific gene that makes us sensitive to bitter tastes. And if you've got a particularly active gene or multiple copies of this gene, this may make you so sensitive to subtle bitter tastes in cilantro and maybe in cabbages that it puts you off. The Oxford Companion to Food, the food Bible of all time, says that coriander, which is basically cilantro, is said to derive from the Greek word for bedbug. So you can tell people have been complaining about this for centuries. Actually, the flavor or aroma of cilantro is quite complex, and many people find it delicious, but many do not. Now we're going to come to my lima beans, because I love an opportunity to whine about lima beans. Now, lima beans is just me. My family generally likes lima beans. Food writers describe lima beans as plushy and delicious. No, right? Anybody hate lima beans? Come on, guys. Yeah. Well, to get to lima beans, we have to go through this sweet-faced lady whose name is Fanny Trollope. Fanny is the mother of Anthony Trollope, the Victorian novelist who wrote those huge tomes about vicars and town gossip in mid-19th century Britain. Well, Fanny, in the early 1800s, was deeply in debt, to the point where her husband, whom she refers to in her journals as Mr. T, had fled to the continent to avoid debtor's prison. So Fanny decided to take some of her 6 children and emigrate to America and go to Cincinnati and set up what she called a bazaar, which is what we would call a mini mall. She was going to sell bonnets and fabric and souvenirs. She was going to have a little tea shop and sell crumpets. Well, she got there, and Cincinnati was a frontier town. Nobody wanted crumpets or bonnets. And by the time she had finished building the bazaar, she was even more in debt than she had been in the first place. So she decided to write a travel book. I mean, who wouldn't? So she did a whirlwind tour of America, and she wrote a book called The Domestic Manners of the Americans, which if you ever get a chance to read, it's actually a hoot. Fanny liked nothing in America. The Mississippi River was a murky stream. The trees grew too close together. The kids were rude. Hoe cakes, corn cakes were an abomination. Watermelon was vile. You could only choke it down if you drank claret along with it. The writings of Thomas Jefferson were a mighty mass of mischief. Tobacco was repulsive. People served chipped beef for tea. Even Niagara Falls, according to Fanny, was really much better looking from the British side than from the American side, where it really just wasn't quite so romantic. So this book sold like hotcakes. All the Brits bought it because they wanted to hear nasty things about the Americans. And all the Americans bought it because they wanted to know exactly what nasty things Fanny Trollope had said about them. So Fanny made a lot of money. She retired to a villa in Italy and lived happily ever after. The one thing in America that she had something nice to say about was lima beans. And she pointed out that clearly this delicate vegetable was something that crass Americans could not possibly appreciate, so British gardeners should really take up the lima bean. Lima beans, I have always pointed out, are basically not our friends. I mean, the original lima bean was out to poison us. These primal beans were full of cyanogenic glycosides, which means that if you bite the lima bean, you cleave this molecule and it releases cyanide. The beans have it because they're trying to fight off pests and predators, which would be like human beings eating lima beans. Our current lima beans, the newer cultivars that we have, are very, very low in cyanogenic glycosides, so we're not risking poison anymore. And also, if you cook the lima beans, this gets rid of these compounds, so we're all safe. But you can see what the beans had in mind. The other thing lima beans do is they produce a compound called prunettin. And prunettin looks like it enhances longevity, at least in fruit flies. So, you have to start somewhere. So they discovered that fruit flies given prunettin lived at least 10% longer than other fruit flies. And these fruit flies could climb up the side of a test tube much, much faster than the non-prunettin-fed fruit flies. And the other thing is it only works in male fruit flies. So men, lima beans. Oh, this is the problem with tomatoes. I know. Tomatoes have had a long history as a poison suspect. And it's not really their fault. It's the fault of their evil relatives. But early on, potatoes had a lot of nasty nicknames. Wolf peach was one of them. And the story goes that they were called wolf peaches because people compared them to these yummy-looking bits of poisoned steak that people put out in hopes of poisoning wolves. It's a story. There's a lot of stories that in the past of garden vegetables. So maybe some people seem to be happy eating tomatoes. One theory about the poison reputation of tomatoes was because in the colonial era, they were often eaten off of lead-heavy pewter plates, and the acidity in tomatoes might have leached some of the lead out of the plates. But the far more reasonable guess is that tomatoes just have some really nasty relatives. They have some good ones, too. They all belong to what's often called the Nightshade family, which includes potatoes, tomatoes, eggplants, peppers, and mandrake. and deadly nightshade, and belladonna. And the problem with these nastier plants is they look pretty much like tomatoes. And when the tomato was introduced into Europe from Central America, the witchcraft craze was still up and running. It lasted from about 1300 and something right through the 1600s. In the course of this, at a guess, over 500,000 women were put to death. It was a miserable period. The Pope's physician in 1545 had gone ahead and published what he insisted was the recipe for the stuff that witches put on their broomsticks to be able to fly. And this contained henbane, mandrake, deadly nightshade, and hemlock. So we've got a witch's ointment that's full of these plants that really look like tomatoes. This picture that you've got up here is deadly nightshade. And it looks pretty much like a cherry tomato. So one guess is that certainly in Europe, and particularly in Northern Europe, where the witch thing was going great guns, no woman in her right mind wanted to be caught growing anything that looked like it might be a witch's plant in her garden. Maybe. In the United States, it looks like tomatoes were grown quite early on down south, whereas up north, we would have been very suspicious of them. In fact, there's a lot of historical stories about tomatoes being forbidden, ministers being spurned for growing a tomato in their gardens, that kind of thing. But it might be more likely that the tomato up north was just a sour grapes problem. Tomatoes come from Central America. The early tomatoes were warm weather plants. So they thrived in the south. We didn't have all the cultivars that we've got now that enable us to grow them in Vermont. In fact, there are cultivars of tomatoes now. There's one called the Siberian tomato that apparently has a growing season of about 15 minutes and will grow on the tundra. But way back when, maybe you just couldn't grow the things, and so obviously they're poison. Oh, here's another vegetable question for you. Is this a vegetable? Do you remember back in the Reagan administration, there was that big hoo-ha over whether ketchup counted as a vegetable for the purposes of school lunches? Which sounds so wrong, doesn't it? Well, nutritionally, this gets a little interesting. The raw tomato is less nutritious than the cooked tomato, particularly the cooked tomato that's been cooked up in some olive oil and turned into mush. And the reason for this is one of the major nutrients in the tomato is lycopene, which is a pigment that makes tomatoes really red. Well, lycopene comes in two different chemical configurations. One is called the trans configuration, and in that state, the lycopene molecules are in long, skinny little things like needles, and they're not absorbed very well through our digestive tracts. If you cook that tomato, particularly in olive oil, the lycopene rolls up like a snail into what's called the cis configuration, little round things. We absorb these about 50% better. So we get more nutrition from the cooked tomato than from the raw tomato. I know that's completely counterintuitive. On the other hand, ketchup's got a lot of sugar in it. So, I don't think we can go for ketchup as a vegetable all the way. Thank goodness. Okay, this is a Carl Rose cartoon that was in the New Yorker in the 1930s and became very famous. It was a meme of the 1930s, which has, an upper-class woman with her flower corsage peering down at her little curly-headed tot and saying, "It's broccoli, dear." And the kid says, "I say it's spinach, and I say the hell with it." Spinach, like turnips, has never been a hugely popular vegetable, particularly among kids. Spinach comes from Iran. The name actually comes from the Persian for green hand. And it seems to have gone east before it came west. The Chinese grew it quite early on. It came into Europe apparently with the Moors in probably the 9th century, when they came across North Africa and into Spain. And from there, it gradually spread through Europe. And it seems to have been particularly popularized by this woman in this incredibly rich but uncomfortable looking dress. This is Catherine de' Medici. And when she was 14 years old, she came from Italy to France to marry the future King of France, Henry II. And she was said to have introduced the French to tons of things. Almost certainly many more things than she actually ever did. But people give Catherine credit for forks, sorbet, pantalette-shaped underwear rather than petticoats, olive oil, macaroons, the ballet. But what seems to have stuck is spinach. And Catherine came from Florence, Italy. And her love for spinach sort of echoes down to recipes today, because anything that's described in a recipe as Florentine, like eggs Florentine, has spinach in it. So, back to Catherine. In the United States, there was a big uptick in spinach consumption in the 1930s with Popeye, who wasn't a totally admirable role model, but he did popularize spinach by, whenever he got in trouble, chugging down a can of spinach, developing bulging biceps, and attacking his enemies. And the myth that was going around at the time was that spinach contained as much iron as a T-bone steak. So it was really, really good for you and a whole lot cheaper than T-bone steak. And apparently, where this came from was they were blaming a German chemist named Emil Wolf, who apparently was said in the 1870s to have screwed up a decimal point and made it look like spinach was loaded with iron, whereas actually it really wasn't. Well, it looks like Dr. Wolf is off the hook, because it's a much more complicated story than that. Actually, spinach does have about as much iron as red meat. The problem is it's iron in a form that we can't digest. Most of the iron in meat is what's called heme iron, so it's iron that's bound to a protein, so that our digestive tracts can slurp it up. The iron in spinach is non-heme iron, and we have a hard time absorbing that. What we do get from spinach is a pantload of vitamin A, so it's still good for us. Spinach. When I was researching this vegetable book, I learned a lot about baby vegetables. And I had always believed that baby spinach was infant spinach, that you went out and picked it when it was a tiny little baby before it got time to develop into big, tough adult spinach. And this is not true at all. This is actually a tiny cultivar of spinach. It's more like a toy poodle than it is like anything else. It doesn't get any bigger than little bitty baby spinach. So then I started looking into other baby vegetables, and baby vegetables is very deceptive. Baby beets, actually there are cultivars of beets that stay little tiny. They don't get much bigger than ping pong balls. They're adult beets, but they're called baby beets. These things up there in the corner that look like dill pickles, those are baby avocados. They're sometimes called avocaditos. And they're non-fertilized avocados, so they don't develop that great big seed in the middle. So they're sometimes called cocktail avocados or baby avocados. Some baby vegetables just had miserable childhoods, like baby artichokes. Baby artichokes are the ones that grow way down on the bottom of the artichoke stem, unlike the big, plush artichokes that are up on top that get all the sun and the water and the food and the attention. These are the neglected, tiny little artichokes, baby artichokes. Baby onions are just tortured. Baby onions are like Chinese-bound feet. They're planted really, really close together so they don't have a chance to grow into big onions. Baby zucchini, that really is baby. Baby zucchini is what you pick as a baby before it turns into those Hindenburg-sized vegetables that, develop in the garden if you aren't paying attention. But baby carrots are a whole different can of worms. There are cultivars of carrots that are little, so they don't get very big. They look like baby carrots. But most baby carrots come from carrots that look like this, really deformed, awful-looking carrots. And the idea for baby carrots came along from a farmer in California in the 1990s who realized because of funny-looking carrots, he was wasting up to 40% of his carrot crop, which is a lot. I mean, food waste is a disaster globally. One guess is 30 to 40% of the world's annual food production is completely wasted. And part of it is because of ugly-looking food. Now, these carrots taste perfectly fine, but they look awful. So the idea this farmer had was he was going to grind these carrots into little ball shapes and market them as bunny balls. Well, bunny balls didn't take off very well. You can imagine that there was a lot of jokes about the bunny balls. So somewhat later, somebody else came along and said, forget the balls, we're going to grind them into the shape of little tiny carrots, and we will call them baby carrots. And those have been, a marketing success. In fact, kids who, for years, the top favorite vegetable among small children has been French fries. All of a sudden, we've got baby carrots moving up the list. So, this has been a real plus nutritionally for the younger generation. Now we come to Madame Pompadour's underwear. When I was first starting to talk about vegetables to groups, and I had what I thought was a lovely title with the wolf peaches, the poison peas, and Madame Pompadour's underwear, I must have given 3 talks in which I would forget one or the other of these things. Now I've got it all written down, but I would walk away and realize I'd never mentioned wolf peaches. So now I check it off the list. We are doing the underwear now. So asparagus is not native to the United States. It's native to the Mediterranean area. The ancestral asparagus was a little crawly maritime plant that grew around the Mediterranean coast. And it's now endangered because so many people have tromped all over it. We see a lot of wild asparagus, and all of that is escapees from colonial gardens. There's no native asparagus. The Romans loved it. This is a Roman mosaic showing bundles of asparagus. There was actually a Latin saying, quicker than it takes to cook asparagus, which shows that they like their asparagus kind of al dente. And we've got pictures of how they cooked it in these sort of vase-like, tall, upright pots that you just stuck a bundle of asparagus in with, its little heads pointing up. And apparently you didn't cook it very long. Pliny the Elder writes about asparagus. Pliny the Elder is delightful. In the 1st century CE, he wrote a 37-book encyclopedia in which he was trying to collect all the knowledge in the world. And he didn't vet any of his information, which makes him really fun to read. I mean, he was perfectly willing to believe that there were herds of ants in Libya that mined gold. Everything. He wrote down everything he found out. And he's got pages on asparagus. According to Pliny, asparagus will cure elephantiasis, serpent stings, intestinal disorders, and if you smear yourself all over with a paste made of crushed asparagus and olive oil, you will never, ever be stung by bees. So, you can see how useful that would be. Asparagus, again, was important. It basically died out in Europe with the fall of Rome because it was a difficult crop to cultivate. You had to pay a lot of attention to it. You had to harvest it every day. And, once we entered the Dark Ages, we were much more likely to be growing turnips and field peas than we were to be growing something a little more complicated like asparagus, which you can appreciate if you've ever read the instructions for planting and growing asparagus. It all starts with things like dig a 2-foot ditch, which our asparagus grew without us having to dig that deep a ditch, but that's what it says. Asparagus did survive in the Middle East. And so when the Moors came across Africa and into Spain, they brought asparagus with them. And asparagus was particularly popularized by this guy with the lute in the big turban. His name is Zuryab, which meant the blackbird, which was his nickname. At the court of Cordoba in Moorish Spain in the 9th century, this guy was basically Martha Stewart. He was an arbiter of culture, taste, table manners. He was paid a huge salary for this. He was also famous for music, which is why he's shown with a lute. He was said to have memorized 10,000 different songs. But he also came up with the idea, the fad of changing colors of clothes with the seasons. Remember how our grandmothers always told us, no white shoes before Memorial Day? That was Zuryab. You switch colors with the summer, then again with the winter. He invented an early form of toothpaste. He came up with the idea of drinking from crystal glass glasses rather than metal goblets because metal makes stuff taste peculiar. He came up with the idea of wearing your hair in bangs. And he popularized asparagus. He was a real asparagus fan. And from Spain, with its popular asparagus started to spread through the rest of Europe, into France, for example. This is Madame Pompadour. She was the mistress of King Louis XV in the 18th century, was renowned at court. Apparently she was absolutely gorgeous. The Pompadour hairstyle is named after her. There's a color, rose pompadour, a pink, that's named after her. I looked it up. It's kind of a bubblegum color. The champagne glass is said to be based on the shape of her breast, though that's attributed to a great many other people, including Marie Antoinette, Madame du Barry, who was another mistress of Louis XV, Diane de Poitiers, mistress of King Henry II, the Empress Josephine, and possibly even Helen of Troy, which seems a real long shot. In all cases, this champagne glass was the old-fashioned coupe, the cup, not the flute, which would have been really odd. But asparagus, which pops up suggestively out of the ground in early spring, has been renowned for centuries as an aphrodisiac, which I have to tell you is true of practically everything else in the garden that's even remotely cylindrical. It has been suggested to be an aphrodisiac by somebody at some point. So Madame Pompadour was known for cooking asparagus for the king in hopes of beefing up his sex drive. And the asparagus she cooked looked like this. It was a blanched white asparagus. You know, it was healed up so that it never developed chlorophyll, so it stayed pale. So she had this pale, purple-tipped asparagus. Which brings us to her underwear. At this time in Britain, there was a military regiment that was known as the Pompadours. And military regiments at the time were differentiated by the color of the facings on their uniform jackets. And the Pompadours had purple facings on their jackets. And this reputedly was the color of Madame Pompadour's underwear. So these soldiers, I'm sure, had a high old time pointing out that they were wearing Madame Pompadour's underwear color on their jackets. Fart Proudly. This is a little-known publication by Benjamin Franklin, who was very well known for science in his time, and was somewhat anti-British. He felt he had been poorly treated at the court of St. James early on in the course of the American Revolution. So he wrote this and sent it to the British Royal Society. It's an entire treatise on things that make your urine or intestinal gas smell peculiar. And one of these was asparagus, which you all know is true. If you eat a lot of asparagus, your pee smells kind of peculiar. This is because asparagus contains asparagusic acid and a bunch of other sulfur compounds, which just go right through your kidneys, and there you have it. Our founding father. Oh, this is blueberries. We can skip over blueberries, but the point of the blueberries is that practically everything that we grow in gardens today was domesticated by about 3500 BCE. The Neolithic farmers did it all. You know, everything they could get their hands on, they domesticated. There were only a couple of things that were domesticated in more modern times. One of these was the blueberry, and one of them was rabbits. Rabbits weren't domesticated until around 600 CE, you know, early. But they were domesticated mostly in monasteries because there was a papal decree that said that you could kind of get around the no meat on Friday prohibition by eating rabbit. Rabbit didn't count. But one of the things the Neolithic farmers did definitely domesticate was peas. This is a medieval peas porridge pot. Peas are a vegetable so old that nobody really knows where they came from. You know, botanists can track some things right down to absolute point of origin. You know, they know exactly what region of Mexico the primal corn came from. Peas, the best they could give us was, you know, someplace between the Middle East and the Himalayas. And then the oldest pea remains that have ever been identified come from the Spirit Cave excavation site in Thailand. And those were about 12,000 years old. So basically nobody really knows where peas came from, but they were all over the place early. They were also kind of terrible peas. They were very, very starchy. There's one theory that the early peas had to be roasted and peeled, kind of like we eat chestnuts, just because they were so tough and pithy. And that's one reason that peas were often served with mint, because the earlier very starchy peas kind of tasted like wallpaper paste. And so by adding mint, you got a much more attractive tasting dish. Good peas, we kind of owe to this guy, who is very underappreciated. His name is Thomas Andrew Knight. And Thomas Knight was the head of the Royal Horticultural Society for decades. And he got to fool around with plants all his life because his older brother died, at which point he inherited a castle, 10,000 acres of land, an enormous bank balance, and a lot of leisure time. So he spent the rest of his life studying plants. And the story that he used to tell is that he got interested in this as a small boy when he saw the castle gardener planting what looked like little pebbles and sticks and being told that these were going to turn into bean plants. So he planted his pocket knife in the expectation that he would get a pocket knife tree. And when he didn't, he became interested for the rest of his life in how do plants develop and how do you get different cultivars of plants, how do you get a better apple, and so on. He was kind of an apple and pea man. And sometime in the mid to late 1700s, he discovered a wrinkle-seeded pea that was really, really sweet. It was absolutely delicious. And these peas were actually the equivalent of our sweet corn. They're mutants. They're missing an enzyme called starch branching enzyme, which is what converts youthful sugar into adult starch. But these peas were stuck in childhood, so they never switched their sugar into starch. They stayed young and yummy. Peas promptly became very, very popular. And as a scientist, I find Thomas Knight's story really heartbreaking because he did all the right experiments. He crossed his wrinkle-seeded peas with smooth-sided peas to see what would happen. He crossed short peas with tall peas, white-flowered peas with red-flowered peas. He accumulated mounds of data on peas. And there it sat. He never took it the next step, which is what this guy did, Gregor Mendel. About 50 years later in Austria, he repeated all of the experiments that Thomas Knight had done in Britain. But he took it the step further and came up with all the laws of inheritance. So he had the idea for dominant and recessive traits and why various kinds of plant crosses worked to produce the kind of hybrids that they produced. So that's why we call it Mendelian inheritance instead of Knightian inheritance. I mean, he just missed it. It's painful. So basically, it's due to Thomas Knight that peas today are really yummy. And here is where the peas were poisoned. This is the Francis Tavern in New York City. It's still there. You can still go there for lunch. It's delicious. When we went, we didn't have peas, being a little suspicious. But when George Washington was fighting the Revolutionary War and losing battle after battle on Long Island and in the New York area, he and his staff frequently met at the Francis Tavern, probably to drown their sorrows in drink. But at one point, there was a plot by a loyalist named Thomas Hickey to poison a plate of peas that were destined for George Washington. Luckily, the tavern owner's daughter, Phoebe Francis, caught on to the plot early on, grabbed the plate of peas and flung them out into the yard where they were pecked up by the chickens who dropped over dead. And it was realized that this plot had been almost successful. They managed to arrest the perpetrator, and he was hanged in New York before a huge crowd of 20,000 people. And Washington survived and went on to win the Revolutionary War. So I've always talked about this and said this is such a cool historical turning point. You know, if Washington had dropped dead then and there, the morale of the already faltering Revolutionary Army was, at a low point. We probably would have just collapsed and stayed a colony of Great Britain. So I brought this up at the dinner table one night, and my kids said, if he'd been poisoned by that plate of peas, we would have stayed a colony of Great Britain. Slavery would have been abolished in the 1830s when it was abolished in Great Britain. We would never have had the Civil War. A lot of the problems that we have today, which have grown out of the Civil War, we would not be having. And so maybe these poison peas wouldn't have been all bad. I thought, oh God. So I just toss it out. You can think about it. So I'll just, the final quote on peas comes from Winston Churchill, who had some great quotes. He said, the 4 best things in life are hot baths, cold champagne, old brandy, and new peas. And I've just hit my hour. How are you doing? I mean, do you want to hear about peppers? Do you want to quit? Do you have questions? Peppers? Let's see. Pepper. This stuff is black pepper. The stuff that's in our pepper grinders. This comes from India. It grows on a climbing vine. And it was absolutely worth its weight in gold through much of the Roman period, through the Middle Ages. To this day, Prince Charles, in his role as Duke of Cornwall, gets annual tribute from his Cornish subjects of a pair of gilt spurs, a load of firewood, a pair of greyhounds. He's been getting this for years. I don't know what happens to all those greyhounds. A longbow, and a pound of pepper. And the Duchy of Cornwall has been in existence since the 1200s. So this tribute has been going on for a long, long time. And back when the Duchy of Cornwall was first established, pepper was incredibly valuable. If you were a serf and you could manage to scrape together a pound of black pepper, it would buy your freedom. Well, when Constantinople fell to the Ottoman Turks in the mid-1400s, this cut off the pepper route. All of a sudden, the major trade route bringing black pepper into Europe was in disarray. The price of pepper went even higher than it was before, and people were really desperate to find a trade route that would get you to India so you could get pepper, which is why Columbus got funded, because Ferdinand and Isabella really wanted a source of pepper. He didn't find it. Instead, what he found were chili peppers, which turned out to be almost equally popular. It's 2 whole different chemistries. The bite that's in black pepper is from a chemical called piperine. The stuff in chili peppers, especially hot chili peppers, that runs you screaming for water, though mashed potatoes would be better, are capsaicinoids, which can be really wicked stuff. Usually the hotness in peppers is measured in Scoville heat units. Not anymore, but we've kept the designation. Usually now it's a much more complicated chemical process to test how hot a pepper is. But how they used to do it was that they would have a whole bunch of little glasses of a sugar solution, and then you'd crunch up your pepper, and you'd dilute it sequentially in these little cups of sugar. And the further out you could dilute your crushed pepper and still sense the hotness, the hotter the pepper. So poblano peppers, for example, are like 500 to 2,000 Scoville heat units. Jalapenos are 2,500 to 8,000. The ghost pepper, which was really famous in the news a few years ago, had 1 million Scoville heat units. And there's one today called the Carolina Reaper, as in Grim Reaper, which is 2.5 million Scoville heat units. I don't think you can even look at this thing. And the reason hot peppers are shown in a range of heat units is because the weather will change how hot the pepper is. If you get a heat wave that goes through, all the peppers in its path will get hotter. They'll boost. So, Vermont's jalapenos don't tend to be as hot, for example, as New Mexico's jalapenos, unless we have a really, really hot summer. Now, the bell pepper has 0 Scoville heat units. It's not hot at all. And the bell pepper story sort of starts out with this guy. This is William Dampier, who was a pirate in the late 1600s. But he was a really elegant pirate. He was not only a pirate, but he was an author, a scientist, a dedicated foodie. His journals read like recipe books. He went around the world 3 times, and he wrote, this is his bestseller up here, A New Voyage Around the World, which started a rage for travel books that lasted for decades. He rescued Alexander Selkirk from his desert island and brought him home to England, which is what inspired Daniel Defoe to write Robinson Crusoe. He wrote the first English description of a zebra, and he did nothing but eat and write down accounts of what he ate. He ate flamingos, armadillos, locusts. He had a lot to say about locusts. He said that their heads would crackle between your teeth. He ate sea lions, he ate ostrich eggs, he ate Galapagos tortoises, and he described them as tasting like chicken. He may even have started that tasted like chicken thing. But he had one of his crew people was a guy named Lionel Wafer. Lionel Wafer had been a surgeon in the British Navy, but he jumped ship to become a pirate because it looked more profitable and possibly more fun. And Wafer got injured in a gunpowder explosion. So Dampier dropped him off in Panama to recover with the indigenous, the local tribe. And Dampier showed up a year later to pick him up, by which time Wafer had been incorporated into the tribe. They found him, he was tattooed. One story says he had a bone in his nose, which, yeah, maybe. But he resumed his pirating. He went back to sea with Dampier and became quite wealthy as a pirate, eventually settled down in Virginia, in Williamsburg, Virginia, where he was promptly arrested for piracy. And he weaseled himself out of this somehow, possibly by making a gigantic contribution to the nascent College of William and Mary. So if any of you guys have acquaintances, friends, relatives who went to William and Mary, they went there on pirate loot. Dampier wrote a book about his experiences with Dampier as a pirate and in Panama. It was called Wafer's New Voyage and Description of the Isthmus of the Americas. And it was translated into multiple languages. It sold very, very well. And in it, as far as we know, is the first English description of the bell pepper and the first point at which the bell pepper was given the name bell pepper. And the only guess anybody has about this is that bell peppers, they're sort of vaguely shaped like bells. But there we have it. It comes from Lionel Wafer, the pirate with William Dampier. There's a lot of questions about why we actually like hot peppers. You know, they're painful. And the reason they're painful is that we've got a receptor that's called the TRPV1 receptor that's supposed to keep us from getting scalded. It's set off by temperatures above 109 degrees. You know, if you're in super hot bath water, you know, that's where you're going to get, your brain is going to get its warning that this thing is a little too hot for you. But the capsaicin in pepper will set this receptor off. It will stimulate this receptor at body temperature. So you think you're being scalded, it feels like you're being scalded, but you're not actually being scalded. And nobody knows why we like this. You know, one guess is that it's the same thrill that we get out of things like roller coasters and horror movies. You know, they're scary, but we're not really in danger, but we still get the thrill of being scared without anything happening to us. And the other is that this hot pepper may set off a cascade of endorphins, you know, endogenous morphine-like molecules that just make us feel good. Nobody really knows. But they're good, right? Mexican food, everybody likes that. I have to stop. I can burble on about vegetables forever, but this is late. I'm sure you've had plenty.